right, welcome everybody. Just playing around with Zoom as we get started. Welcome to our August 11th sustainability chat here in Colorado. Couple quick announcements before we get started with our guest speaker. Hi, I'm Brian. I am your vice president for the Colorado State Beekeeping Association, as well as the head of the sustainability chat. This has been our first year doing the sustainability chats, one a month. We'll have them roll into our YouTube channel after we have them afterwards. So keep looking for those on our Colorado State Beekeeping Association YouTube channel. We also have this Thursday coming up a special presentation with Dr. Zachary Lamas. As many of you may know, the USDA has announced the closing of the Beltsville lab. Dr. Zachary Lamas, who is one of the PhDs who works at that lab, has been talking to folks about the ramifications of that potential closing and moving to other spots. So that is Thursday night. If you have the CSBA Facebook page account, you can get that link on that page there. It's this Thursday at 7 o'clock. And it doesn't matter if you're a Colorado beekeeper or not, you're welcome to join that conversation just to hear where Zach is at and what the current status is. I believe the announcement said that they were going to get relocated. The labs there were going to get relocated, distributed across 5 different labs throughout the state. One of them being Fort Collins, and that could have some positive impacts and it could have some negative impacts. So it'd be interesting to hear Dr. Lamas's perspective on that. So that's this Thursday. We also have November 1st is our fall state meeting in Denver, Colorado. We have Cory Stevens, who is our guest speaker tonight, is also going to be our keynote speaker for our fall meeting. We also have Rogan Tokash, who just acquired his PhD from the University of Auburn, who is going to be a speaker as well, doing a lot of great innovative things in the research industry. So a lot of great voices to hear at that November 1st meeting, again in Denver, Colorado. Kathy, if you could jump in, where can people find information about that if they want to buy tickets or hotel reservations? Do you have the details on that part?
I don't have the details completely done, but I know that we'll get it on the website as soon as I have the confirmation for the hotel, but we've got the confirmation for the speakers, and then I'll be able to put the address and everything that everybody needs. We are also planning on the night before a meet and greet. Hopefully it's going to be a Halloween based because it's Halloween that night. So looking forward to that, you guys.
Right on. Thank you very much, Kathy. And with that, let's transition to our guest speaker for tonight. Tonight, we are honored to have Cory Stevens. Cory Stevens is the owner of Stevens Bee Company out of Missouri. Oh, I can't remember the town, Cory.
Well, it's not exactly Bloomfield, I guess, which is
Bloomfield, yeah. Oh,
kind of west of Bloomfield a ways out in the
gotcha.
sticks.
So Southeast Missouri, that's
Got
about
it.
right?
Yep.
Gotcha. Cory specializes in queen breeding, raising VSH, Varroa sensitive hygiene queens. Cory's become kind of the spokesperson for VSH here in the country in the past couple years, and we are honored to have him talking about the Harbo assay. If you are unfamiliar with the Harbo assay, it's one of the demonstrated methods for determining VSH behavior in your colony. So Cory's going to take us on a deep dive about how we can learn all about the Harbo assay. And then as an aside, several of us from the state of Colorado will be joining Cory at the end of August to learn more about the Harbo assay, learn some hands-on skills, and then we'll be taking those skills back to local clubs in Colorado to be able to push out that knowledge. It's great to have a conversation. I love being able to talk with people like you on these kind of chats, Cory, but there is nothing like sitting in a room together or sitting in a bee yard together and getting that hands-on experience. So Thank you
It's
so
true.
much. Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you so much for offering that up to Colorado beekeepers. That education is going to get pushed out to many, many folks. So with
Awesome.
that, Cory's got a presentation on a deep dive into the Harbo assay. If you have questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat. If it's pertinent in the moment, I might just kind of ask that question at that moment, or we might wait till the end of it. All right, go for it, Cory.
Cool. I'll screen share here. All right. Is this here? Yeah, that'll be perfect, Brian. If something pops in that's pertinent, or if I need to elaborate on something, feel free to jump in here. So, what we're talking about here is the Harbo assay. I don't know if some of you may not have heard of VSH, but we're going to talk everything about VSH here and how to measure it. So, all these pictures are mine, of course. Typically, they're instrumentally inseminated breeder queens. That's one way I concentrate it. I do a lot of open mating as well, but typically I just collect drones out of those open mated queens that test high. So hopefully I don't annoy you too much with added acronyms here, but I've added SMR, and I'll talk a bit about that, why I add that. I think it's still relevant. So what is SMR/VSH? SMR stands for suppressed mite reproduction. VSH stands for Varroa sensitive hygiene. We'll get into why those two acronyms are joined at the hip. So how do you measure it? I've messed with exclusively stuff that was purportedly VSH stock for 15 plus years now. And for a long time, I didn't know how to measure it. The only way that I knew how to see if it was legit or not was to withhold mite treatments, which most beekeepers do not feel comfortable doing, justifiably so. But taking that approach, it did allow me to see that not all VSH are created equal. Some of them weren't as VSH as they purported to be, but until I was taught how to measure it, I was just a VSH hoarder for many years. So, how do you get VSH in your bees? It's a legitimate question. We'll cover that in depth. My experiences with VSH, like I said, I've messed with VSH different lines for over 15 years. So I've seen a lot of stuff, seen some good ones, seen some that lacked. What you should expect if you acquire VSH or you have actual VSH in your apiary, and looking forward, how I think that this will pertain to beekeeping. We've heard a lot about Amitraz, which was a really good miticide for many years, starting to fail. The bees are starting to, the mites are starting to develop resistance to where it's no longer effective. So I think that makes this conversation even more pertinent. As we mentioned before, if there's something I'm talking about that you have a question about right away, or something I should elaborate on, put it in the chat. Brian will field those questions and we'll tackle that more in depth. If you'd like, we can wait, or if it's not something we need to cover right off the bat, we'll do a Q&A at the end. And I hope you have some questions, because if I talk and talk and talk and then there's no questions, it's a little awkward. So don't be shy. So what is SMR/VSH? Again, kind of annoying. I'm using not just one acronym, but two now. SMR, suppressed mite reproduction. VSH, Varroa sensitive hygiene. So we imported Varroa in the late 80s. The USDA Bee Lab in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The scientists there were tasked with identifying forms of mite resistance. So if I understood correctly, a small number of colonies, like maybe 12 or less, were given or asked, the USDA was asked to evaluate them. The beekeepers thought there was something to them. There was some form of mite resistance, but they had no idea what it was. So they did discover it, again, in the late 90s. It was Dr. John Harbo, which is where the term that Brian mentioned earlier, the Harbo assay. Assay is just a fancy name for test. Where the VSH test came from was Dr. Harbo, and he actually released that after he had retired. So we knew about it for many years, but there was no standardized assay or test released of how to measure it, or I would have found it. I was just tearing the internet apart for years, obsessed over this and trying to find whatever I could about VSH. I would have found it if it was out there. So VSH is not a breed of bee, it's a trait set. So you hear beekeepers talk about Italians, Carniolans, Caucasians, Russians. Any of those lines of bees could exhibit VSH, but not, to my knowledge, not all of them have received intensive VSH selection. So it's probably in those lines and maybe in small quantities unless somebody's really selected for it. It's labeled an additive trait. So again, it's not a breed of bee, it's a trait set that you can add to your population. So we'll cover how you can add it to your population. And again, it was first termed suppressed mite reproduction. Why? Because the USDA, whenever they had discovered this in the late 90s, they were evaluating brood and they didn't know exactly by what mechanism, but they knew that these colonies that they thought were resistant were somehow suppressing mite reproduction, which is amazing because most of the stock that we buy, commercial stock, are mite factories. They don't have any type of resistance mechanism. They're naive to the mites, and they just keep raising brood, and the mites just exponentially increase. Again, they knew the bees were somehow limiting the mites' reproduction, but they weren't exactly sure. So I think later on, I believe it had something to do with some of Marla Spivak's work. If you've heard of Minnesota hygienics, a lot of you have, or hygienic bees. Hygienic, like a freeze-killed brood, tested lines of bees. They had said previously they weren't exactly mite resistant. It didn't equal mite resistance, but it was very, they were resistant for brood diseases like chalk brood and such. So after they were digging into this suppressed mite reproduction phenomena a bit more, they found that the bees were somehow, they thought through scent, detecting that there was a reproductive mite in that brood cell where there was a bee pupa that was developing. So they would open the cell, remove the pupa, which would disrupt the mite's reproductive cycle. She would have to start over again. So after they found out it was a hygienic function, it was a removal and expelling the pupa from the hive, they changed it to Varroa sensitive hygiene because it was specifically targeting reproductive mites. It was crazy. You would find, if you were looking through the brood, non-reproductive mites, it's like they would just leave those in there oftentimes. But if they were reproductive, they would pull them out and throw them outside. It's crazy. So they are suppressing mite reproduction, but they changed it because they believed it to be a hygienic function. That's why the SMR was changed to VSH, although I still believe it's applicable for more reasons than just that we'll get into. So Dr. Harbo detailed out the Harbo VSH assay. He did not release that into the public until I think he did it around the same time. I was in his breeding group, so he had requested individuals that had hoarded or selected some lines of VSH, which I qualified for. I had for years and years. And this was around 2019, actually not that long ago. And this is whenever he gave the instructions on how to measure this to his breeding group. And I think shortly after he had posted it for public access, no one was really paying attention to it. I think if you were in the inner circle at the USDA bee lab, obviously they had protocol to work on the USDA lines, but this was not, there was no simplified instructions that were released to the public. So They were released to his breeding group first. I think the first time we tested was early 2020, not that long ago. So before that, I was just a hoarder and I was letting natural selection sift through what was acceptable and what didn't pass muster. And then I was using instrumental insemination to concentrate that. After Harbo released these instructions, of course, we coupled that to our population that was already really high in VSH. And here we go. This is my friend Erin Mullins. She was past ambassador for Missouri State Beekeepers. She was the state fair chair coordinator. She's a glutton for punishment. I think she's still helping out with the state fair this week for Missouri State Beekeepers. It's a popular booth, so she's doing a lot of good work. And here I was showing her what frames that you're looking for if you're going to do a Harbo assay. I've seen some academic publications lately. They're trying to catch up and they're trying to stay relevant in some aspects and are starting to explore this. One problem I've seen is they're pulling pupa that are too young in the pictures or video that I've seen. So here I'm showing Erin what age pupa we're looking for. There's a specific reason for this. Basically, if you pull frames out and you see brood starting to emerge, if anybody has ever pulled out frames, either started to graft or whatever, and you have the little fuzzy new bees emerging, those are the ones you want because there's patches of really mature brood there. What we do is when we find that emerging brood, we brush all the bees off of the frames and we put them in nuke boxes here and then take them to the lab. Also, if you're just brushing frames and taking them in and you find out, oh my gosh, this one's 100% VSH, if you didn't label it of which colony it came from, kind of pointless. So I use little numbered tree tags. It's just an aluminum stamped numbered disc. I put those on my bottom boards, and whenever we pull a frame out of said colony, if it's number 72, we write 72 on the top bar, brush the bees off, and put it in the nuke to take to the lab. Pretty simple. Here is a video a YouTube friend of mine took. There's, downsides of hanging out with YouTubers. Here we go.
Well, that wasn't very nice of you.
I actually didn't say any bad words there, but he took the liberty of adding some bleeps on there for humorous purposes. I thought it was pretty good. Like I said, hanging out with YouTubers, hang out at your own risk, especially if they got a camera pointed at you. So here we go. How do you measure VSH? We use a Harbo assay, VSH assay. Assay, as I mentioned before, is just a term for test. To get a VSH score, again, remember I said that I still like to use the term or the acronym SMR, suppressed mite reproduction. Well, this is why it's so relevant. These two are joined at the hip. I still like the term SMR. So to get a VSH score, you're measuring the bee's ability to suppress mite reproduction. That's why it's still relevant. So, as I mentioned before, you're looking for that brood that is starting to emerge already. You're looking for already pigmented pupa. I really like it when they're starting to turn black already, but right before they chew the cap, for multiple reasons. So, if you're observing colonies that are exhibiting VSH behavior, so you're seeing them work brood where they're opening brood, you'll see a lot of uncapping, some recapping. And if you look at them pulling out pupa, it's almost always white to purple-eyed pupa, sometimes even a bit later than that. So I try to wait for that brood to be fully mature so that the mite has every opportunity to reproduce. We want the really quality data so that we want to give the mite every opportunity to reproduce, and also whenever we want the bees to be able to actually perform VSH. So if you're pulling white pupa and the bees are pulling white pupa at the same time, you might just be a little bit ahead of them. So give them a little bit, wait, let that pupa mature. all we're doing is, it's a simple spreadsheet. So you'll write the colony number. Brian and you all will see this whenever we get here. We usually keep a paper copy, and then I'll put it on a Google Sheet. That way I can access it easily in the field. But it's quite simple. You just write colony number, number of reproductive mites. Reproductive mites are, if you are opening up a cap and you look in there, most of you have probably seen Varroa. You know, they're kind of oval shaped, reddish orange color. Well, you will find some that are the exact same size as her, but they're deutonymphs. They're not mature yet, so they're white or kind of translucent looking. And then you'll see smaller brothers or male mites. They're shaped a little bit different. If you see a male and multiple females and an older foundress mite, it's a reproductive. If you only find the foundress mite, non-reproductive. Once in a while, you'll find a foundress and only a male. Obviously, if there's no females to mate with, they can't reproduce, so we call that a non-reproductive. But you know, it's not something you see all the time. It's usually just a foundress mite, or there's the whole family is in there. So the colonies are scored 1 to 4 on their ability to suppress mite reproduction. This is a simple assay. It's not foolproof, and I'll go over some ways that you can get false positives, which are quite common. So fours, if you have a level 4 VSH, it's suppressing 100% of mite reproduction. So you should find 0 reproductives. Even if you double the sample size and go to 200 pupa, you still should not be finding reproductive mites. It's a fun group activity. Invite your friends. Only kidding. It's not that fun. Some people, I am joking. Some people love it. It's tedious. You know, we usually put some music on, have some laughs. It's more fun if it's a group, but it can be kind of tedious. You're sitting there pulling hundreds of pupa at a time and, you know, measuring data. So this is Harbo's VSH score chart. As you can see, there's 3 columns. The third column has your score, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Some of them go really fast. If you've got good mite pressure, which you have to have, if you've, you know, recently treated or even treated in enough time that the bees, there's just not a lot of mite pressure in your area, you're going to be really prone to getting false positives. So that's one problem with a Harbo assay is it fights your IPM program. So I'm really hoping that, you know, I was really hopeful for UBO. It seems like there's some overlap with VSH with UBO. It's still early. A lot of people are still experimenting with it. So, you know, and I have found a false negative with UBO. So with Harbo, my concerns are false positives that people are coming across. And with UBO, you know, there is a possibility for false negatives. So the middle column is probably the most straightforward. The column on the left is valuable percent of infested worker cells, but they can contradict each other. We had an argument last year. I say argument, spirited debate over what a score was, and I was like, it's a 3, and some of the guys from Michigan, Matt, Kobe, was like, no, it's a 2. I'm like, dude, no, and so I'm like, that's it. We're emailing John Harbo, and John said it was a 3. So in certain instances, the 2 columns can kind of contradict each other a bit, but this is the best we've got right now until somebody comes up with something better. I feel like it's a simplified assay, but I've had great success with it, and it's definitely worth the time. So I mentioned some of these tests are a little tedious. Brian, sorry, it was last week, but sometimes I'll entice people, some friends of mine here, Aaron, Kyle, my wife Jamie, with box seat tickets to the rodeo. That got some VSH testing done here. Aaron has a bucking bull, which he wasn't here at the time, that she owns. I think his name's Captain Morgan. but it did help. One picture of a VSH testing event. On the left here, you can see Eugene Makovic. He wanted to come down and see it for himself. He's the current editor of American Bee Journal. I've known Eugene for years. We served on Missouri State Beekeepers Board for a long time. That's how we met Aaron in the back here behind Eugene, Kyle, that's stretching, Kyle Day, and Will Salmons here on the right. I haven't seen Will in a few years. Picture of us out here at the farm. We're testing in spring here, as you can tell. If you have a steady IPM program of killing mites, I wouldn't recommend testing in the springtime. I think you're going to get too many false positives. Until that mite load builds, it's too difficult to get solid data. You're going to get false positives. So, but with mine, they haven't been treated. Again, I don't tell people they shouldn't treat their bees. It comes with a great risk, but again, I didn't know how to measure it for many years, so that the only way I know to do it was let Mother Nature have her way with them, and if she didn't crush them, there was something to them. So I've just continued that, which worked out because with Harbo assays you can get false positives. So I haven't used any miticides in over 15 years, so I don't worry so much about false positives. And I bring in experimental stock from other people too, so to test out, and we have mite pressure. All right, Eugene again here, another testing session here on the left. This gentleman right here, Nathan, was responsible for the bleep bleep video you saw earlier, making me look bad. I think he took great joy in that. He has a YouTube channel, Duck River Honey. Over on the right here is the Summers family, Dawn, Chris, Natalie. Natalie has a YouTube channel, Beekeeping with Natalie. She's a really good young beekeeper. She wanted to come see what it was all about. So,
And I think both Nathan and Natalie have some content on their channel from that visit. So you can go and see some of that content as well to get their experience from
yep.
when they went and visited you.
Yeah, Nathan says he would affirm that it is no fun. I don't know. Eugene seems to enjoy it. He keeps coming back. We usually have a good time. And Natalie and them have helped me out a ton. Experimental UBO testing, VSH testing, all kinds of good stuff. So, how do you get VSH in your bees? There's multiple ways. This used to be an easy button. So, back whenever I first started bringing VSH in, Tom Glenn Apiaries, would sell instrumentally inseminated breeder queens. He held the CRADA, or Cooperative Research and Development Agreement, with the USDA. So they were testing stock and exchanging it with Tom, and Tom was selling breeders to get VSH out into the market. I don't know how he made any money because he was selling these breeder queens that were phenomenal for a $100 bill. It's a crime. It's ridiculous. They're worth far more than that, but I'm thankful that I had access to them. I was the only one working at the time, so if they were $1,000, I probably wouldn't have got my hands on any. But now I would say these are a lot more difficult. There are people that make breeder queens. Most of them don't carry concentrated VSH. John Harbo did, which obviously he's one of the scientists that discovered VSH. He's retired from the USDA Bee Lab. And last year was the last year he was going to sell any artificially inseminated breeders. So there's not a lot out there, but there's other ways to go about it. You can buy VSH queens or cells. Most of the stuff that's open mated out there, I'm pretty skeptical of. There may be some that has some levels of VSH in it to where you could get some in your apiary. A lot of the stuff that I've tested or know where it came from, I don't think the stock tests that high, to be really honest. There's just been a lot of stuff, and I think that's a lot of why there's skepticism about VSH, as there's been so much stuff pawned off as VSH that wasn't, or didn't have very high levels of it, to where people were disappointed. So if you can find queens or sell queen cells, that's a good way to do it, way to introduce it into your apiary. A lot of people will say, well, I don't want cells, I want a breeder queen. Well, what are you going to make with a breeder queen? You're going to make cells. So you're not really getting ahead having a breeder, but the beauty of it is if you get your hands on one, you can make as many as you want. This is the most difficult way to get it in your apiary, is just to test and start identifying colonies that display VSH and have some level of it, and then just prioritizing those high testing queens as queen mothers that you're going to graft out of, and then just make a ton of daughters, test those, pick the highest ones that are your favorite, that are productive, because if they're not productive, I mean, what's the point if they're not going to make honey and be workable and have plenty of brood for splits? Then it's great that they're alive, though, I guess, but they need to be productive too. The problem with that approach is you can't quit. You have to keep selecting, you have to keep testing, and you have to test on an annual basis. So it's not easy, but it can be done. Raise queens from the highest scoring colonies is pretty straightforward. If you're testing stuff, if you happen to have instrumental insemination, obviously you catch drones out of high scoring colonies as well. That's the beauty of the F1. So, I mentioned earlier you could buy queens, virgins, even, or cells. So if somebody is doing a lot of testing and they have instrumental insemination to where maternal and paternal line are both high VSH, then like if I send a handful of queen cells to Brian, even if Brian doesn't have VSHBs, if those queens mate with non-VSH drones, that colony still should exhibit measurable levels of VSH, at least for the first generation. And another cool thing is, some of you have heard that drones have no father, only a grandfather. So, regardless of what they mate with, queen cells out of these breeder queens that have been tested on both lines, all the drones that they produce for their lifetime should carry VSH. That's kind of cool. So if you queen whole apiaries with VSHBs and they're just producing drones during the growing season, you're really sending a lot of VSH out into your neighborhood. So really cool. Another picture of a breeder queen. Most of my bees, I say, are Italian-ish. You can see this girl's a little darker colored, but still an Italian-looking queen. Most of the workers are a lighter colored bee. I'm not completely hung up on color, more so performance. Um, Even though they're Italian, I don't feed a ton. So if there's some that just brood themselves into oblivion, they weeded themselves out of the gene pool at some time. So, I don't have your typical Italians. They're highly mite resistant, highly brood disease resistant, and they're pretty conservative of stores. So if stuff stops coming in, they usually tone it down. They keep a bigger brood nest though, so they may not be quite as fuel efficient as some Caucasian and Carney lines, but compared to other Italians, they're quite efficient. These are queen cells that I've raised. You can see I use JZBZ shipper bars. I put them in these little JZBZ cell protectors and they go in the incubator. So this lets me keep a weekly schedule. So I have queens shipping every week. These are freshly emerged virgin queens. I was given this presentation the other night. I'm like, yeah, that spoon over there kind of looks suspicious, but definitely no drug use going on there. I was making queen cage candy with it, so if anybody's
What
wondering.
what were the pluses on top of the queen cages? Some of them, see the marks you have there? What are those?
Typically, whenever I'm emerging these, so I try to inseminate a round of queens every week or so. If anything's small, it goes in the trash. But sometimes you see some that just seem extra large, and I mark those cages just so I'll hold some back for me, and usually I mark more than what I keep. So yeah, those are
So
just
that's the beginning of your quality control of your virgins.
absolutely, yep.
Got it.
And a lot of those pluses get sold too. It's just I try to keep a few that way. When they're about 10 days old, I can make some breeder queens out of them. My experiences with VSH. I've had a lot of experience with VSH and stuff that was purportedly VSH. So, not all VSH are created equal. Um, Even some stuff that is sold as VSH, the people that are breeding them aren't even using a VSH assay per se. They're looking at mite washes, which isn't a bad metric, but it's not a VSH measurement per se. Um, we did mite washes alongside Harbo assays last year with the Michigan group that came down, and while high VSH colonies typically keep a lower mite load, so if you're just looking at wash data, you're probably inadvertently selecting for some VSH. It almost turns meaningless at times because whenever you take a mite wash, you're taking a sample of an infestation rate or an in a rate of mites coming in the front door. It doesn't mean that they weren't doing anything with it. It just meant that they were robbing a colony, or however they get the little turds. They're getting into them and they're bringing them home. So, if you do a mite wash and the mite load starts to climb, it doesn't mean they're not VSH. You have to look into the brood and see if they're shutting mite reproduction down. So, are there any guesses at what the highest wash that I found? This is August 31st or September 1st of last year. No treatments the year before or the last 15 years. What do you think the highest wash was that was still 100% VSH? Now, this was an outlier, but still.
You want people to put their guesses in the chat?
Yeah, take a few guesses. We'll see if you get close.
While people are doing that, Kathy put in a picture of varroa mites at different stages in the chat with the adult female, different stages of the female, as well as the smaller males to the bottom right-hand corner too.
Perfect. So if you see those, the smaller males, and you see those female dudonymphs, the lighter colored females, that's a reproductive. So what
right.
guesses?
We've got 47, 26, 42, 3, 5, 23%, 3. I'm gonna guess like 60. There's got to be an outlier there somewhere.
You guys were brutal. Some of them may be that high. It was actually 18 mites in a wash.
Wow.
It could be higher than that. It just depends on your mite pressure. But like if you're using a mite wash as a pre-screen, I don't know what the cutoff is. If you're getting those 60s and all, I would say they're probably not VSH. But I mean, it just depends. If your mite pressure is outlandish and you have a bunch of high loads, you would just have to test them to see. But yeah, most of them are smaller numbers, but upwards of 18 in my apiary. And this was a apiary that had around close to 130 colonies in it, so there was should be a lot of pressure, especially not being treated. So
That really speaks to the difference in baseline that you're dealing with in your genetics versus most of us. If I do a mite or a mite sampling on 50 of my colonies, I'm going to have plenty over 18 at this time of the year. So I think that's a symptom of what you're working with and how you've bred that into your bees, Cory.
totally, yeah, I would agree with that. Like the highest wash we had was 50 something, and it was an imported queen that came from a friend. So uh, it's nice to have those in there to remind you that you've actually made a lot of progress with breeding, because really even with that 50 some odd wash and having queens from a couple different sources in there, a lot of them were mine. Even with those high washes, the apiary infestation rate was still, I think, below 3%. So if you take out those higher washes of some of the import queens, it's lower than that, and that was untreated. So I think that's just proof that it works. It's not perfect. It's even with instrumental insemination, I still do mass multiple matings. I could probably tighten that up if I really like use single colony drone sources and such. I think I can tighten it up even more because you'll have some that'll score threes. Occasionally you'll have a two. I usually don't have them where they're just getting overrun with mites, but overall they're absolutely mite resistant. You can definitely see overall good brood patterns. So there's a bit of a caveat there. I'll uh, I'll show you some pictures of what bald brood or uncapped brood looks like, but overall you get really good brood patterns. VSH uncapping and recapping. This is something, if people post pictures of it on the internet, you, you get, even from experienced beekeepers, chalk brood, European foul brood, failing queen, drone layer, queen needs to be replaced. Like it's chaos. Most beekeepers don't understand what high expressing VSH lines look like whenever they really start working that brood, and it freaks beekeepers out. So I'll show you a picture of it. Another thing, the USDA Bee Lab, I don't know who, or maybe multiple people, but they've said before that VSH bees don't work drone brood. Check this out. I use these for catching drones out of high testing colonies whenever I let them fly out so they're not full of poop. They can fly off to the singles bar, and whenever they come home here, the door's locked, and I catch them off the entrance here. You can see these drones coming back from a flight. This has probably been on here 20 minutes. Check that out. Drone pupa, drone pupa. So they were uncapping and removing drones, which we all know that mites prefer drone brood. And so it does me a lot of good to see that my VSH lines do work drones. I actually had someone from Sweden uh, send me a message through my website. I checked it today. He may have sent it a few days ago. I kind of get behind on those at times. But they called the phenomena drone DB VSH, drone brood VSH. I guess because they had read maybe some USDA literature that said they don't work drone brood. But I've got lots of pictures over the years of my bees working drones really hard, harder than worker brood, which makes sense. Um, and uncapping them and recapping them, just really checking them out. Matter of fact, I probably should add pictures of that to this slideshow, but I don't believe I did that. I think I just had this as an example. So hygienic brood removal, you should see pupa getting pitched out, shouldn't be abnormal. You should see lower mite loads, like Brian and I just talked about. You should see, mine typically stay below that 3% threshold, even untreated. September 1. Um, Lower viral loads. This is something that I just figured out through experimentation. So I mentioned I used to get those Glen breeders. Well, I was collecting feral bees. I would buy commercial stock. Like I just had like most beekeepers, I had a hodgepodge of all kinds of different bees. And occasionally I would see one that had deformed wing virus. If you haven't seen that, when the bees hatch, their wings look like two little pieces of yarn. They'll never fly, they'll never forage, they're a drag on the colony. So whenever I would see that, a colony that had a lot of those in it, instead of doing like most beekeepers would and treating it and cleaning it up, which is not a bad idea, I couldn't measure VSH. I wanted to see, well, what are they capable of? If I can switch that queen out and put a VSH queen in there, what happens? Well, some of them were too far gone and they would crash and burn, of course. But if I could get that queen to take, if I caught it early enough, within 6 weeks I would go back in there and zero bees had deformed wing in there. They cleaned it up every single time without exception. If that queen took, I would go back and they would no longer be showing deformed wing virus. that was cool. So this was several years ago, but to back that up, that was just redneck field data. But to back it up, Randy Oliver had asked for samples from untreated apiaries. They wanted to test for deformed wing virus A, deformed wing virus B, deformed wing virus C. And they wanted bees that had not been treated. So I sent him samples. Maybe I cheated a little bit, but I sent him samples of F1 VSH colonies that they hadn't been treated, but I knew their lineage. And it took a while. The University of Salford and the United Kingdom were the ones that ran the viral analysis, but for my apiaries, it came back deformed wing virus A below quantifiable levels, deformed wing virus B below quantifiable levels, deformed wing virus C not existent, it's not in my apiary. So I think what was going on there is these VSH bees could detect reproductive mites in the brood, but I also think that if the pupa was sick, they knew it and they would throw it out. So it took me a while to figure this out, but what I think was happening is, okay, take for instance, what happens when a nurse bee emerges? Of course they eat, but what do nurse bees do? They go lick everyone's face in town and feed everybody through trophallaxis. And Zach Lamas, that you mentioned, that's coming on here soon, had some research out that showed that bees can pass deformed wing virus through trophallaxis. So I think how they were breaking this cycle, reproductive cycle, is whenever the pupa was sick with high levels of deformed wing virus, it got thrown out and it was never a nurse bee. So only healthy bees were emerging as nurse bees, and so it mechanically broke that viral cycle. It's the only thing that makes sense to me. And some of Kara Wagner's UBO or hygiene data would backs that up. She saw the same thing, that some of the bees that were pulling it out had higher viral levels, but they would either fly off and die or fall on the sword. I don't know what they're doing, but the colony level as a whole had way lower viral loads with bees that were really hygienic. So really cool. It's not just effective against mites. You'll never see chalk brood. You'll never see American foul brood, and you have lower mite loads. I mean, what's not to love about VSH? So I mentioned earlier, you have some really good brood patterns. So if you look closely, some of these, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, that has a darker center. That capping in there is dark. Some of them look a little bit dimpled and have a darker spot on it. Through here, there's darker ones. Down here, some darker ones, definitely right in here too. Those have been uncapped, so they opened it up to see what was going on in there, and it seemed fine, so they just recapped it. Not all of them get recapped while you're looking through the colony. If you look at this, all three of those have been uncapped. That one, that one, that one. Several of these have been uncapped, recapped. Several of these in through here. But look here. These are wide open. This freaks beekeepers out. They just immediately think it's chalk brood or failing queen. Like I was saying on the internet, they just lose their minds. It's never good. There's a few people that'll say, probably have heard me or someone talk that is echoing what I'm saying, but I look at this as a positive thing. So if you look at a lot of research from bees in Cuba to bees in Europe, and they really start studying resistant stock, Randy Oliver's presentation to who was it? It was a group in Australia, Australian Queen Breeders Association. He's saying that whenever he was selecting for mite resistant bees and he's having reasonable success, he starts to see uncapping or bold brood. Now, here's the thing. Years ago, I opened up one of my colonies that had a Glen daughter in it. I looked, and some of these cells are just open, but some of them had heaped up walls. I was like a fourth year beekeeper. I'm like, whoop, drone layer,
Hmm.
killed her,
Hmm.
threw her out in the grass. And like I said, I was on the internet every night, digging for VSH, digging. Well, I found a fact sheet that John Harbo, Jose Villa, Jeff Harris, some of these guys at the USDA lab had put out on VSH. What do you think I saw a picture of that night? This. They said, uncapped brood. That's your first visual indicator of VSH. Doesn't mean it's VSH. You have to test it to know. Sometimes you get bees that are getting their butts kicked by mites and they start to open up pupa, but they don't have a good pattern like this. They look like garbage. They're getting their butts handed to them. So they said this is your first visual indicator, but further testing is needed. But then they didn't tell you how to test. Thankfully, John Harbo later told us how to test. So if you start seeing this, don't freak out. Take a mite wash. If you're not seeing a lot of mites, they could have a hygienic component to them, so it might be something you want to keep, especially if it's productive. If it's a little dinky colony or something you don't really dig, maybe not. But this colony here, I had a picture of was a double deep brood colony with multiple honey supers on top. Whenever I took this picture, it was actually a breeder queen. So don't freak out if you see bald brood. VSHBs still get mites, like we were talking about, Brian. I mean, they're still there. They're always going to be there, but VSHBs shut down mite reproduction. Again, doesn't mean they won't get them, just means they limit reproduction. You still, if you're not a breeder, I would still rely on an IPM program. If you have VSHBs and you start getting a higher load, maybe you're next to some commercial people or just tons of bees in your area, lots of hobby beekeepers, and you start to get a mite load that's a little bit. Now, don't get me wrong. If you're running high VSH stock, they can tolerate a higher mite load. But if you start getting 20s, that 18 I told you about, if that's the norm or higher, they will benefit from being cleaned up from miticides. Like mites are a stressor. They're a death sentence for a lot of bees, but they're still a stressor, even for VSHBs. So I would say treat as needed. But if your levels are super low and you're running a lot of VSH stock, you could probably get away without it. Expect to see some bald or uncapped brood, definitely. If you're buying VSH stock and you never see a single cell of bald brood, I would question it, personally. Uncapping is cited as the visual indicator of VSH, like that fact sheet from the USDA. I wish I could dig it up. It's probably like buried in the internet somewhere. I've searched for it recently. I found it a couple years ago again, but man, I don't know. Maybe somebody could help me find it. Like I said, it was Jose Villa, John Harbo, and it was just like a VSH fact sheet. If you search VSH on the USDA website now, tons of stuff comes up, but not what I'm looking for. So maybe somebody will find it. Queen cells. I have tons of pictures of these. I love taking pictures of my queen cells. I may have more of them on my phone than my kids. Don't tell Jamie. So looking forward, here's a cool picture. I went to take a picture of one of my breeder queens here. You can see her with a blue disc on her back. This was several years ago. And if you look to the left, oh, there's a pupa being pulled out, and it's a white pupa. Like I mentioned earlier, if we're going to do a Harbo assay, don't be pulling white pupa. Do not be pulling purple-eyed pupa. Those are not the right age. You want them to have some pigment or even be black, really close to emerging. Those are my favorite. So looking forward, you hear people, I finished a master's degree in entomology. It's all about bugs and all about IPM, integrated pest management. They drill that into your brain. So many beekeepers and so many farmers and people talk about IPM, and they don't talk about host resistance. This is natural resistance mechanisms, whether it's honeybees, sheep. There was something I heard the other day about someone who was raising sheep, and they were really light on worming their sheep, and the sheep had bred natural resistance mechanisms. So if you let Mother Nature have a hand in the breeding process, which I've really tried hard to do, your stock is just more rugged. You know, like look at wolves and look at a pug. Cute little dog, a pug. We did that. That's from selective breeding. I'm not after a pug. I want something that, you know, fairly domesticated, something I can work, but something that handles its own. That's what most of us want. Kind of get back to the old days where we can work the bees, we can enjoy them, but we don't have to be constantly pumping chemicals in them to just actually keep them alive. You know, that's more like the chickens at the bulk farms, you know, where they have no survival mechanisms. They have to be fed constantly, medicated to stay alive. That's not the bee I'm after. So I project increasing adoption of VSH by the industry, especially with Amitraz starting to fail and people are scrambling for other miticides. Host resistance is the only long-term solution, the only sustainable long-term solution. Period. End of story. Anything we're sticking in there that isn't in there naturally is just a stopgap, as Randy Oliver called it. It's just a short-term solution. I'm not interested in short-term solutions. Again, especially as resistance builds to popular miticides, I'm not anti-miticide. I just don't want to rely on them 100%, because whenever you rely on them 100%, Mother Nature finds a way around it. So if we have strong bees that are actually mite resistant, and occasionally we have to use oxalic or formic or amitraz, they work better because we're not using them constantly. That's actual IPM. Just having a constant treatment regimen, that's not IPM at all. IPM literally, if you read the book, it will say to treat as little as possible and to only treat when needed. So lots of sampling. Okay, decentralized VSH selection. I think more people are going to start selecting for it. It's not easy, but again, I think it's the only long-term sustainable solution. So more people are going to do it, especially after you show people that it's possible. I think because, you know, I heard a saying years ago that breeding bees that are resistant to Varroa is like breeding sheep that are resistant to wolves. I'm like, that's catchy, but false. But I mean, I could see how they would think that. You know, it seemed futile or hopeless for a while, but that's not the case. Just like Mother Nature finds a way around amitraz, like how the mites find a way around it, the bees find a way around pests and diseases. You know, it's a two-way street. And I think we can reduce or possibly eliminate costly and annoying miticide applications. They're not fun. No one loves to do it. We do it because we don't want our bees to die. And a lot of them will die if we don't intervene, unfortunately. So I think we should start shifting towards this. It's only going to have positive benefits. The inspiration for me to start breeding 16, however many years ago, was something Tom Glenn wrote. He's the guy that was selling those breeder queens that were out of this world. And that was back when we were using Apistan strips. I think it was fluvalinate. And Tom's like me. Whenever you're working your beehives, if there's some burr comb there that's honey, I open my veil and eat and chew it. It's so good. Well, he was cutting out some burr comb, and his hive tool stopped on an Apistan strip that he'd left in his colony, and he wouldn't eat the honeycomb. He's like, "What are we doing?" And that just seared into my mind that there's got to be another way. And so I've just been obsessed with it since then and seeing some success. So that's good. I was able to leave my day job last year, March 1st, just to breed bees exclusively. So I think we're going to really make some progress here. And we have already. So before we hit some questions here, my website, I do sell queens. This isn't the whole purpose for me presenting. I hope that other people will start to do the same thing. But, I do sell stock that has been highly selected. My email, stevensbco@gmail, Facebook. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. I'm on YouTube. A lot of my stuff now goes on Patreon. That's what I put on the bottom. I've got some Patreon subscribers. Thank you all, probably that are in this crowd. And it's basically to support starving artists. If people are doing cool things, you can do a subscription, have access to webinars, uh, interviews with cool people you can sit in on like this and ask questions and stuff, and just support people in the industry that are doing good things. So if you feel inclined, check out Patreon, Stevens Biko. Let's take some questions.
Thanks, Cory. Cory,
Certainly.
will you start with talking about the physical process? Actually start by talking about frames. We had Ann asked a question, do you freeze your frames? Talk about the storage and transfer of those frames, just generally speaking, during that process.
Sure. No, I don't freeze them. You probably could. Somebody told me that, who was it? It may have been Robin at Penn State, said that they had frozen some frames to test later, and the freezer failed. So they were
Oh,
rotting. They were
oh,
rotting frames. I'm like, oh, that's horrible. So, but you can do that. You could freeze them and look through them later, and then your mites wouldn't be running around. However, a lot of times John Harbo would say that he would collect frames the day before, and then he would test them the day after, because your brood is going to be continually emerging out of these frames anyway. So the stuff that wasn't quite mature yesterday is going to be ready tomorrow or today, and so you can collect them the day prior. I never refrigerated them. I put them in those nukes that you saw a picture of, and we just set them outside. And then, we'll go and brush them off and bring them in the following day. So whenever Brian comes and crew, we're probably going to pull a few frames just to show you what's going on. But if the weather cooperates, I hope to have a lot of these frames pulled, especially out of out yards stuff that I'm wanting to test, so we don't have to run all over the place. So some of those will be pulled the day prior. You don't have to freeze them. Also, if you don't freeze them, you let them set a day. The following couple days, those bees just keep emerging. Like once even with no bee coverage, that brood generates enough of its own heat that the bees will keep hatching. So if you didn't freeze it and you put it back in the colonies, they'll still get a nurse bee boost, or you can add it to some nukes that you want to winter or whatever. Um, Preferably not ones that are just overloaded with mites, but I guess you could put them in there and then treat them. But yeah, I don't freeze it. You could, but I don't.
so just to clarify, you're putting frames from different colonies in a single box. You're not shaking the bees off until it's time to pull out those frames and do the actual testing of that frame. Is that
I,
correct?
I do brush them off, but those
Okay,
nurse bees just continually emerge. So if you let them set overnight or whatever, you pull it out, you're going to have a bunch of nurse bees on there. So
okay,
if you're
okay.
going to a friend's house or something, I try to just brush them off, even though they're going to keep emerging while you're doing assays. So you'll have a few bees around, but they're not going to fly, little nurse bees. But yeah, I do remove all the adhering bees whenever we pull the frames out. I'm just giving them another brush down before I bring them inside, because typically we're testing in Jamie's office that I commandeered, and so just as a courtesy to her, try to get rid of all those bees that I can.
Yeah, I know that life for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Anything else about the handling or storage of frames? Like as they go back as soon as you're done or whenever you can, obviously.
Yeah,
Um,
that's pretty much it. Once we get done, I usually sometimes we have to go down. If it's a 2 deep colony, we'll have to go to the bottom to find what we want. But I'll take one of the frames out of the top and put it down there. That way, whenever you go back to put them in, you can just pop the top and put them in and not have to dig and figure out what goes where. I sometimes, because we had such a nice crew last time, we put the frame back in the colony it came out of, although I'm not concerned about that. I think it just kept us from having to pop a top on everything. We just shouted out numbers and found them, and it went really quick. So
Sure. Do you ever throw an empty frame in when you pull the other one out and then just use all those pulled frames for like nukes or something?
you totally could. I haven't, just because this time of year I try not to have drawn combs sitting around. You know, we have
Yeah.
wax moths that just destroy them, or if there's a lot of pollen in it, we have small hive beetles that get really annoying. But if you did, or if you had some in the freezer, that would be brilliant, Brian, because then you wouldn't have to go looking through all those colonies. You could just put them all together and add them to, like, I winter 5 frame nuke stacks here, like double
Yeah.
stack fives or triple stack fives, and man, you add those to those things, and then you have a fall bloom or feed them. They winter so well. So yeah, you could
Yeah.
totally do that. That's a good idea.
Talk about that process, that actual mechanical process. Talk about the tools you use, the ones that you found you like using, the ones that you don't like using. I know John Harbo's even talked about using your cell phone as kind of like a magnifier. Tell
Yep.
us through your experiences, through that process, for some of us that might have older eyes, what are
Yep.
some of those things that you've done that's helped you with that mechanical process of pulling out that brood to inspect them?
Certainly. So first and foremost, you're going to want to get a pair of fine forceps. I thought I might have some close to me here. I don't. I think they're over here on the table, but they're just pointy tweezers, basically. So I
Okay.
tell people try to avoid the tweezers in your significant other's cosmetic case. A, they don't work too well. B, you're probably going to get in trouble. So it's best to just order them off of Amazon or somewhere. They're cheap. They come in multi packs. It's just a pair of fine forceps with the very pointy ones. So with the eye plucking tweezers, eyebrow, people peel them off. So one of my buddies, Kyle, man, it took me. I still think my office chair has like cappings on it. I roll around and somehow they come out from years ago. But you don't want to peel that cap off. Really, you want to just poke the center of the cap and then make a circular motion, and it just pushes it out of the way. Then you can really see, okay, that one's not old enough, or this is one we want. So fine forceps. You mentioned I'm past 40 now, unfortunately. So I was teaching one of the University of Missouri guys how to rear queens here, and he gave me a pair of 2X readers from Costco. Man, I love those things for grafting and such. So, if you got some readers, or definitely if you wear glasses, you absolutely want to have those with you. Um, but you don't have to have extreme magnification to find this. Um, some people use these right here, if I can get it. It's like an LED magnifier. I'll have a few of those here, Brian, whenever you all come. I don't think they're absolutely necessary, but some of my friends really like them, like a 10X. They can pull it down and really see what's going on. So whenever you open that pupa up and you pull the pupa out, everybody wants to look at the pupa. So don't do that. Whenever you pull it out, look in the cell first. Because if you look at the pupa, then you look back and you don't remember which cell you pulled it out of, it's easy to miss those reproductive mites that are often in the bottom of that cell. So pull it out, really investigate that cell, and then look at the pupa. So you might notice that sometimes it's dark down there. If you don't have an LED halo like that, if you have readers or glasses, or some people use dental loops or a pair of loops, that's perfectly fine. But I really like to have LED headlamps, even if you don't have a whole lot of magnification, because wherever you're looking, it's illuminated and just really helps to see down in those cells. So fine forceps, any vision aids you want. If you want magnification, it makes it easier if it's easy to use. Some of it can be cumbersome. Also, I really like, does anybody, have you seen those grafting frames where it kind of holds a frame and you can adjust the angle? And then there's a tray where you put your cell bar. Walter T. Kelly or Kelly Bees used to make those. That's what we're going to be using whenever you all come to the farm here. just so you can hold your frame. And I like to make little piles of pupa because we're going to do 100. That's your sample size. And if we don't find what we want, we've got to go to 200. So I make like little neat piles of 5 so I can quickly count 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 and figure out where I'm at. Because we have to be pretty specific on the sample size so everything's standardized. So you don't have to have it, but grafting frame, LED headlamp, or something to illuminate with. You can kill 2 birds with 1 stone with that magnifier I showed you, and then some vision aid is not a bad idea. I can do it without vision aid, but if you do them all day long, it's like staring at a computer all day. If your eyes start to go cross, it definitely helps if you've got some readers. Just 2x, maybe 2.5, maybe 3s. But you also want a little bit of eye relief. I've seen people with jeweler's hoods, they're this close to the comb. That's not necessarily practical. So you want something with a little eye relief. Really, that's about it. It's pretty simple. You don't have to have complex lab equipment, a PhD, a lab coat. None of that stuff's necessary to do Harbo assays.
Perfect. Thank you. You had mentioned a couple other assays in your talk, things like the UBO assay, Randy Oliver using mite counts as a way to do selection. I know freeze kill is another common hygiene assay. First of all, are you using other data to correlate along with the Harbo data for your colonies? And how does the data typically correlate with these other assays?
Yep. Previously, I wasn't. I wasn't taking a lot of wash data because I wasn't looking for a treatment threshold. I just let them be what they were going to be. And I was just using, because I knew I would have mite pressure, and then I was just using Harbo. But just because I like data, I like to see what's going on in there. Last fall, we added a wash alongside Harbo just because it's interesting to me, and so that was really cool just to see a comparison of it. So I will say, if you don't have the time to do Harbo assays, if you're just selecting for lower mite loads, that's a pretty good starting point. The thing is like if you have no mite pressure, you're going to get a low wash. But if you have really low mite pressure, like I mentioned earlier, you could get false positives on the Harbo scale too, because if you don't have mites, um, it, they're just not there, you're going to get a false positive. But I will say the two are correlated. If you have high Harbo scores, not surprising. If the mites aren't reproducing in your brood, your washes are lower. So, I think that's how Randy's had some success. I'm sure he's getting some false positives, and he's probably throwing out some really good ones because they got a load, but he didn't measure their suppression of mite reproduction. But he's doing better than anybody out there, really, just using a simple metric. And I don't know if anybody caught it at North American Honeybee Expo last year. Randy and I were both on a panel, and I thought it might get contentious with my views and his, but I loved it. He came right out of the gates and said, the reason why I'm using mite wash as a selection factor is because nobody has an excuse. Everybody's doing these anyway. We're not adding some complex like a Harbo assay, which is complex and it's time consuming. We're just using data that you're collecting anyway, and you're going to treat these high mite load colonies. So you don't have an excuse. And that's perfect. I won't argue with that, period. But I would say and I don't know if he wants to, add the time to it, but if he would add a Harbo alongside that, man, I think he would see next level gains in his breeding operation. But it's difficult. I mean, it's really time consuming. They spend a lot of time doing washes and stuff anyway. So, I'm not going to fault him for that. So if that's all you're doing, I think it can still be valuable. UBO, um, it's not cheap. It is faster than Harbo. Like if you have less people, you can get more done. in the same amount of time or less. My concern with it was that I know for a fact I've seen false negatives. So, like one of my breeder queens, we had tested it. Kara was here actually the year prior, and we got 100% on a UBO score, and it was a Harbo 4 every time we would test her. It never changed. It was unwavering. And we went back the following June, a year and a week later, same queen. She's number tagged, still a 4 on the Harbo scale, 0 on UBO. So it went from 100 to 0.
And that was during the flow. That was during an optimal time of doing that UBO testing.
It was actually better conditions than it was the year prior. They were a little bit robby whenever Kara was there, so the nectar was, or the pollen was getting kind of goofy, but there was a better flow the following year. Uh, and I don't know what to do with that exactly. So I still think it's valuable. I think it's heritable, but I think the bees' reaction to it, not even the environmental condition changes, I think the bees' reaction to it varies, because we looked at that, and the person I was, well, Dawn and Natalie
Yeah.
and Chris,
Yep.
we had a picture of, they were here to helping me test, and Dawn would make a little mark whenever I would switch vials. So we looked, and the next colony, if I remember correctly, the next colony shredded it, and it was the same vial. So why did they not pay attention to it? I mean, if it was a 60, okay, I can get over that. But 0, like 100 to 0, that's quite a variation. So it kind of shook me a little bit, and I don't know what percentage of that is happening. I'd heard other people claim inconsistencies, but I did a follow-up discussion with Kara, that's on YouTube, and discussed that with her openly. And I know that there's some research coming out of France too, where they took UBO compounds and added some other stuff to it, and they felt like they were getting better consistency. And I asked Kara, are you willing to change the formula or update it, if there's improvements that have been found? And she said, absolutely. So I think it's next level. It's way more technologically advanced than freeze killed brood. So instead of dead brood at 24 hours, you're looking at stressed brood in 2 hours. Way more of a stringent test. And with the freeze killed brood you mentioned, according to research, it may or may not equal mite resistance. Like, a lot of bees can sniff out a rotting pupa, within a day after it's been killed. But it's a lot more specific and a lot more sensitive, the bees that can detect infested pupa, or that there's a mite reproducing in there. That's way different than a dead brood. So
Yes.
I think if you're not doing anything, starting with freeze killed brood, it's a good start. But I really think, as far as measurable mite resistance, VSH is where it's at, really. And you know if I'm just doing Harbo, I'm probably missing something, because I'm sure there's multiple resistance mechanisms, but and some of them may be extremely valuable. Some we may not have even discovered yet, but I know that VSH is super effective because I've seen it. And so until I see something better, that's kind of what I'm hung up on. I also wanted to point out one thing. I mentioned we were measuring suppressed mite reproduction to get a VSH score. So there's been, and Randy chimed in after I gave him my theory. So there was a study that came out a while ago, and I can't tell you exactly what the guy's name was, but basically they denied hygienic removal. They wouldn't let the bees open and remove the pupa, and somehow still the bees were suppressing mite's ability to reproduce. We've typically called it a brood effect. I didn't know how it worked, but I had a theory on it. Again, I've been trained as an entomologist, and I know that, like mosquitoes, for instance, female mosquitoes they got to bite Brian and get a little blood, and then she can ovulate. She has to have a blood meal. Well, ticks are the same way. they have to have a blood meal before they can ovulate. So there's something specific, a protein, something that they're after that allows oviposition or allows them to reproduce. My theory is certain lines of bees are denying or limiting a specific protein that Varroa foundress needs to be able to reproduce or ovulate or lay eggs. And whenever I said that at Bee Expo and that panel, Randy goes, yes, they think it's, I think he said ecdysterone. Uh, don't quote me on that. It's something close to that. If you have a recording, go back and listen to it. I probably need to as well. But he said it was like a testosterone variation or something, a molecule similar to that, which was bizarre. But I actually heard him mention it again in this recording he did for the Australian Breeders Association. So there's something to that. And whenever you're doing an SMR assay, you're looking for a VSH score. Guess what else you might be catching? Brood effect. It doesn't differentiate. Is it a hygienic suppressed mite reproduction or is it brood effect? The Harbo assay doesn't care. It's just selecting for a suppressed mite reproduction. So I think that's a really cool thing about the Harbo assay is you might be just selecting for SMR. So if you're finding it and you're not seeing bald brood or uncapping, you might just be selecting for brood effect, which, hey, that's gold. Because if you cut that mite reproduction down, your mite loads are lower, your viral loads are going to be lower, everybody's happier, less stress.
Awesome. Man, there was so much to respond to in that piece. Let me see if I can go back. First of all, that panel discussion at the Bee Expo with you, Randy Oliver, Dr. Renkevich.
Yep.
One of the Cloys was there as well. Four people with similar goals, but very different ways to attain that goal. That was such an interesting conversation. I sat next to James Lee during that conversation, and his head was about to explode because he couldn't find the question basket. He could not find where to put a question in. So that was super funny. But what a great conversation between the four of you. Yeah, that was an amazing one. The other benefit, I've experienced some of the same questions with UBO, but one of the benefits that you didn't mention was the fact that you can do it under certain constraints without having a treatment-free period on your bees. Now, someone like me who has a business model and I need to make money on my bees, I have this goal about hygienic bees in my apiary, but I got to make money at the end of the day too. And I can't just go treatment-free and throw all caution to the wind to get there for the long game. So that's a
Absolutely.
benefit that the UBO assay does offer me that the Harbo wouldn't.
Yes, it doesn't fight your IPM program, that UBO, because it is not mite load dependent. Harbo
Right.
is dependent on mite pressure, which is annoying to beekeepers because they're good at mite management. UBO doesn't do that. It does not fight your IPM because your data is not dependent on mite loads. I'm glad you mentioned that. Whenever I did, I had I guess it was not last year, but the year before at Honeybee Expo, I gave a Harbo versus UBO talk, and that was one thing I mentioned, just being fair and balanced because they each have have their positives and they have their negatives, like every avenue that we're going to pick. And that's the thing is, I was talking with Matt Kobe and he was like, what do I do? Do I stop treating to get good data? I'm like, dude, I don't know that you should. I think it depends on your long-term goal. If you're like me to where you're obsessed with mite resistance, I feel like I'm put here to just study it and figure out things about it, then yeah, I think you should because your data is going to be tight. If you're looking for honey production, nuke production, you know what I mean? Like
My business model.
your business model, I wouldn't abandon treatment, not until there's a solid supply of queens and you're monitoring and there's just no reason to. You know what I mean? You're not finding mite bombs. We're not there yet, most people. And so Yeah, I think it just depends on your end goal. I wouldn't tell anyone that they should go treatment free. I mean, again, like the only way was if you're just completely obsessed with that and you're just going to breed. And it's difficult to make money doing that. Typically people will say, somebody's got to breed a better bee. And then right afterwards, they'll say, but there's no monetary incentive to do so.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad
Or
you.
they'll say, but I'm not paying that much for a queen.
Absolutely. That's just the way
So,
it goes. I saw
so
somebody
let,
ask, what are my recommendation for treating mites when there are too many? I mean, oxalic acid, formic acid. I still think amitraz works, but don't only use amitraz. Like Dr. Frank Rinkovich, that was on the panel that we mentioned at NABE, he specifically said as long as you rotate it, which that's another IPM strategy, don't rely on
yep,
one mode of action or a single miticide. If you change it up with formic or oxalic and kind of give them a left hook and a right hook, it seems like you don't see the resistance problems. It's only whenever you're constantly using one. So I would say, at this point, you could still use amitraz. Just be sure to change it up with something else. Whether it be thymol, formic, or oxalic. There's still a lot of stuff out there that works really well. And those organic acids, um, you know, in entomology classes, they say the risk is really low that they could find a resistance. Uh, the mite can build resistance to those miticides due to their mode of action. It's not impossible, but it's really low risk compared to some of the chemical formulations. So
yeah.
yeah, we've still got options, and I know people are working on new stuff too. So
Hey, a couple of questions in the chat. Is it common for you to get a zero mite count?
yep, it's pretty common.
Dana, I think that's the young man on our chat asked, what does viral mean? Dana, if you want to unmute yourself and ask anything else beyond that, feel free to jump in, but
Yep, viral is just like Brian said, related to viruses. So if you say there's a viral infection, I mean, it could be deformed wing virus, Israeli acute paralysis virus. There's like a cashmere virus. Like there's just a whole panel of different viruses. So, if you have something that's more bacterial, like European foul brood, then antibiotics work on that. But if it falls under viruses, I mean, antibiotics aren't going to kill it. You pretty much have to have natural resistance. Really, I don't know that there's any products that are proven antivirals for honeybees at this point. But yep, great question.
John Thompson, who lives in Northeast Colorado, so very rural, probably pretty isolated, asks or says, my last treatment was OAD, oxalic acid dribble, last Christmas. Now my August mite washes are mostly 0 or 1, with one colony having 2 per 300 bees. With that low mite pressure, how likely am I to get a false positive with a Harbo assay in September? And that's part of why I mentioned his geography, because his likelihood is going to be way different than my likelihood living in the Denver metro area.
Absolutely.
And then
Yep.
he and then he asks, would it make more sense for me to wait to test until I have more mites? My apiary is pretty isolated.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of reminds me of a conversation I just had a couple days ago with Matthew Kobe, because that was over the should I quit treating, and that's where I was asking him if you're wanting to breed. Maybe, but if not, I wouldn't. But his conclusion was even with late winter, really early spring treatments, he still didn't have enough mite pressure this time of year to feel comfortable about what Harbo scores he was getting. That's why he was considering just not treating at all. So, yeah, if you're getting 0 or 2, I mean, if you've got 2 or 3 mites per 300, you might be able to start getting some data. but the ones that are zeros, you're going to get a 0 out of 200. It's going to say it's a 4, and it's most likely a false positive. So yeah, if I was you, were you, I would wait. But the thing is, too, is like with that low of mite loads, oftentimes whenever you tighten up the brood or they stop rearing as much brood, your mite levels are going to fall anyway. So they may even still be low the following spring. Back to what Matthew and I were talking about. He thought some colonies had to do almost a 2-year cycle before they really started getting a mite load, which is kind of mind blowing, and it completely depends on your mite pressure. Now, I don't know what apiaries Matthew was talking about. Maybe they were really isolated and remote, and there's just not a lot of pressure. Where if you were like Brian and you have a lot more pressure, you are far less likely to get false positives. There's not a cut and dried answer. I wish Dr. Harbo would go into more detail about this. This is just kind of what I figured out through trial and error, where we know some people that are really good at managing mites are getting false positives. That's the thing. Hopefully, UBO 2.0 will update here and we'll have more options, but this is kind of where we're at. But that's kind of a good problem to have, John.
No, I
I
don't
just
know.
don't have mite pressure.
Yeah, right.
Right.
I don't know if this is John or Matthew's situation, but one possible thing they could do is just try a test yard. Have one test yard where they try not treating at all and see how that goes.
Yep.
Again, I don't know if that's their setup or not, but that could
Yeah,
be one
and
way.
that's the thing too, is like, if you have an apiary full of bees and you do start doing washes and you identify which ones are high and you whack-a-mole those, you're also setting yourself up, you're alleviating mite pressure at the population level. So, man, it's tricky because any amount of mite management, that anytime you're starting to intervene or you have light pressure, your amount of false positives goes way up with a Harbo assay. So it's difficult. It fights your IPM program, like we were talking about, Brian. That's the beauty of a UBO. Is the Harbo is just tricky. It's you're kind of having to play with fire to really
Yeah.
get some solid results.
Nancy asks, what criteria do you use for selecting brood frames for testing? You already talked about the purple-eyed. Anything beyond that?
Really, what I do is I'll just shake or brush bees off, Nancy, and I just look for the ones where they're starting to cut the cap already and they're starting to emerge. You'll probably see a couple of them on there. That's usually a solid candidate. If I see more than one emerging, I just go ahead and take it. Yeah, because if
Is
you start,
a pup good?
if you start scratching, because sometimes they'll lay in bands. If you find a band and you're scratching them, you can find
Yeah.
some older ones, but sometimes you just hit purple, 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 and you go towards the center, it's white, 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 white. I've just found if they're already emerging, it's usually a solid bet.
Is that pupa ever too old to pull out? Like if it's the day before emerging, is it not good data? Okay,
No,
cool.
John said he doesn't like to pull those. Dr. Harbo, I don't know if it's moral issues because they're starting to wiggle already and he feels bad killing them, but I like those just because I know the bees had every opportunity to address that and the mite had every opportunity to reproduce. So I think if you get those that are already pigmented, those are absolutely the strongest test sample.
Got it.
Mhm.
Andrea says, thank you so much for taking the time to educate us, Cory. Are there environmental factors that may increase or decrease mite loads?
According to Kara Wagner, she suspected that with the UBO, now that this isn't in regard to Harbo, but with UBO, that environmental factors did affect it. I don't know that that's the case with Harbo. And I could be wrong. Whenever I'm testing end of August or first part of September, usually something's blooming here. If it was a complete dearth, it might be more difficult. And one reason I speculated that is, for instance, I mentioned I think they can identify sick pupa as well to throw out. So think of it this way: if everyone's starving and everyone is stressed in that colony, it might be overwhelming, like the amount of stress pheromones. Now, this is strictly uh, theory at this point. This is not scientifically tested, but it makes logical sense to me. So that could be the case. Typically, when we're testing here, it's not a dearth end of August, first part of September. So it could, it could affect them.
I've heard some beekeepers in the southeast speak about how they believe the heat and humidity plays a factor in their lesser mite loads than they think other parts of the country. Have you heard that? Do you have an opinion of that?
I don't necessarily. I mean, we have it gets hot here and it gets really humid. I was going to say, I think that that's really stressful on the bees whenever you have high heat and humidity. Now, it might be more stressful on the mites. I don't know, Brian, but
Yeah.
I know during those time periods that um, it's almost worse than winter sometimes, that extreme heat and high humidity. It seems like you'll start to see a few queens fail, like you'll come back, you thought everything was good and something went sideways and they failed to requeen. So I don't know. It may be more stressful on the mites, but I haven't taken just constant data to see that fluctuation. It could negatively affect mite populations. That's something I'd love to just be. My goal is just to be a private research and breeding facility and share open source data. I just now have someone that started to work for me. She's really good at mite washes and stuff, so I'm going to have a lot more data going forward. But I felt like there wasn't any more Cory to go around, that I had to scale this and had to bring in some talent. So uh, more to come on that. But right now, it's just speculation.
Eric France, you know Eric,
I do.
says,
You see it.
imagine you stop any mite testing. You walked away from your bees for 5 years in return. Would you expect the same level of high scores in the hives? Are you at a steady state that no longer needs monitoring?
That's a good question. Potentially, and I think John Harbo is experimenting with that. He's not going to be doing any more inseminations, but I'm not like Brian in a metro area where there's tons of beekeepers around me. If that was the case, I think it would go the opposite way. Um,
Hmm.
I hear a lot of people talk about breeding. It's like you're pulling a rubber band. So you have that selection pressure that you're putting on your bees, and if you let go, beekeeper dies, whatever happens. A lot of times it'll uh, course correct itself. Now, if there's not a lot of people out here, there's still a lot of feral colonies, and no one's managing them. I think it would stay steady, but it just depends on what's in your area. And if there's like tons of packages or tons of queens coming in, I think it would be difficult to maintain that. Where I'm at, unless somebody tried moving up against me, which it's not really a great honey area per se, but hopefully it stays um, remote. But if you're in a remote area, I would expect it would stay pretty consistent.
Thank you. I'll answer this one. John says, can you post a link to the expo talk with Randy and Cory? Um, those are great talks. They are, however, behind a paywall. You do have to purchase all those talks through the Bee Expo. There's a single purchase fee. I think it was like $75 for all of the talks. And
Okay.
uh, going to the expo for past 3 years, I can say it is worth the fee for those talks, even if you don't go to the expo in itself. Well worth the money for the not only expert talks, but widely varied topics, not just a singular topic. So
Is it
wish I
free,
could, John. Sorry.
is it
Go ahead, Cory.
free, Brian, if you attended?
Yeah, if you attend, you get the link for those videos. So the videos come with a purchase of a ticket. However, if you don't attend, you can purchase those videos in addition. And
Or
again, well worth it.
you could probably beg Cayman. He may feel sorry for you. Or I don't know if they've entertained this, but I wonder if they would offer like a club rate. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
I think they do. Yeah, so John, you can talk to your club and see if your club is interested in purchasing those. That is definitely something they do as well. Alyssa says, and Alyssa's going to be joining us in a couple weeks as well. What recommendations do you have if one wants to start selecting for mite resistance? Would you suggest testing current colonies or start bringing in known VSH genetics and maintaining that level?
That's a double-edged sword. You could always test what you've got, wouldn't cost you anything. Ideally, if you had something, you could start teasing it out and selecting for it. I didn't have it. Of course, I had bought a bunch of stuff, commercial bees, swarms. I didn't have a lot of stuff. Of course, I wasn't testing. I had some stuff that was good, but I don't know that it was VSH. It just kind of survived, but it would get a mite load. Whenever you start bringing in stock, that's how I fast forwarded to VSH. So it really worked out well for me. But sometimes if you start bringing in stuff, depending on where it comes from, you can degrade what you've already got if you've really teased a lot of stuff out, or if you've developed a line of bees that are kind of homogenous as much as bees can be. Because I know, like, whenever I started with Tom's stuff and just kept going with that for a while, and then Tom stopped producing. I'm like, oh, I need more VSH. So I'd order from somebody else, and my bees actually got worse than what they were before. So I would ask a lot of questions about potential sources, if they're actually testing, what you should expect, and then kind of weigh it on a case by case basis. If you don't have any VSH at all, you're probably it would be a positive thing to bring some in. It's going to fast forward things. And then you can start picking your favorites and selecting out of that. But if you've already got it, if you're seeing some of that uncapping, test it. You might have some of the best stuff known to man. You just don't know it yet. So somebody does, I'm sure. There's a percentage of the population that has it. And occasionally I'll see it posted on VSH forum, and it was something random, that they had caught or whatever that's showing promise. So don't be shy about testing your own stock for sure, especially if it's something
You,
you like.
I was reviewing some of your content to prepare for this talk, and there was one where you and Kara Wagner were speaking to each other, and I think she mentioned something like in the natural honeybee population, 1 to 2% will express this VSH
Yep.
trait set to a high point.
Yep.
And then my suggestion to Alyssa, and Alyssa knows a little bit about my project, is do both. I would say bring genetics in and test. I started by testing my best colonies and found a whole lot of colonies that I wanted to test really well because of other attributes, not score very well on the UBO assay at all. The ones that scored well were ones that were brought in from other programs that were breeding for VSH specifically.
You mentioned
I
the
got
UBO. There was somebody who, it was one of the Arkansas State bee inspectors, and he had tested a bunch of stock with UBO. And he said the only ones that even paid attention to it at all were either F2s or F3s that someone had purchased from me, and then open mated them, grafted out of them. So there is definitely a correlation between, in my opinion, between VSH and UBO. So, if you're going to be UBO testing, if you brought something in that was truly VSH, the odds of having something test is going to be higher. So Ian Stepler told me the same thing. Canadian Beekeepers blog, YouTuber up in Canada. He said they did a bunch of UBO testing, and the only line that paid attention to it was a VSH line. Now, he didn't tell me what VSH or where it came from, but that was just some field observation that he had seen.
Thank you. Jill asked, what is your email again? And thank you for
It's
this
my last
presentation. Your email.
Stevens, stevensbco@gmail.com. Happy
And
to
then
be.
Alyssa asks, do you ever worry about bottlenecking genetics?
Not really. If I was doing like inbred hybrid models, or if I was doing a bunch of single drone inseminations, or if I was doing line breeding, I would worry about it. But I've got so much diversity, I'm not worried about it at all. And my breeder queens, some of them are even super mated. So, I'll collect out of 20, 30 plus colonies that are high scoring, let them homogenize in a flight cage. Then I collect them, and I would assume, some level of homogenation going on. If I let it set for 24 or 48 hours, and my brood patterns are typically stellar. So, no, I think beekeepers worry about inbreeding more than they should. I think that to get really good inbreeding, you almost have to use an instrumental insemination, single drone sources, and really bottleneck things down. I feel like, some PhD studies where they're only using single drone insemination and they do some inbreeding, line breeding, that's whenever you start to see the effects of inbreeding. But that's just not something most beekeepers do, and that's the opposite of the approach I've taken to breeding too. So no, I don't worry about it. And now I've got enough friends too that are starting to test, that if I did run into that problem, Melissa, I would know where to go to import something that's at least reasonably selected, to where I could start working with it again. Just make an outcross, then it's a definite non-issue. Good question, though. Absolutely.
Or you use the phrase micro breeder model. Do you consider your model a micro breeder model? And if not, what is a micro breeder model?
I do. I look at a micro breeder as, like some of the larger people that breed, will have, 1,000, 2,000 colonies or something like that. Although some of them are more so a queen producer than they are a breeder. They're really good
Right.
at making, not so much selecting. So that's probably a talk in itself. But micro breeder, like I bred for years and I had a day job. So I mean, I'm not full commercial at that point. If you have a day job, it's kind of your hobby. You can still do a lot. I kind of view that as a micro breeder, someone who does it on the side or part time, probably, maybe even more so than hive count, because it just depends. Like if you've got insemination, I have less than 300 colonies, and that's my sole income. So you can do a lot with less, if you have insemination, artificial insemination, instrumental insemination, and you're a skilled breeder. So yeah, good question. So micro breeders, I always said it's not going to be one person that helps solve this issue. It's going to be a small army of micro breeders, of people that are testing, and maybe they're not shipping queens all over the U.S. Maybe Brian started testing and has really good luck with queen rearing, and he's just taking care of his area. He doesn't have to mess with shipping. People can come pick them up. I've seen some models like this work, and so I think it's going to be a decentralized solution. It doesn't need to come from one source. You know what I mean? Like I know somebody would like to probably corner the market, but it's better for the bees and the beekeeper if it's more decentralized. Really, there's a lot more genetic diversity. And just like me, for example, if somebody spray plane, flew through my apiary and destroyed everything, if there's a lot more people testing, I could ship a few queens from Brian, cross it with a little bit of Troy Hall, or get something from the Michigan guys, Sustainable Beekeepers Guild, or Northern Queen Initiative. It's just better if it's decentralized. But that's my vision of us making Varroa more of a nuisance than an industry threat, so to speak. I
A
think
big learning moment for me as a beekeeper was buying a couple of nukes that had bees emerging with deformed wing viruses. They were basically dead nukes walking. And for me, that was my motivation to become a sustainable beekeeper and learn how to raise my own bees. And now my next step is kind of been inspired by what you've been doing, what the SBGMI guys have been doing, is trying to learn this idea of now host resistance, right? And then being able to impact, like I've got the sustainable thing figured out in my bee yard. How can I push that out into the community and have that building block of host resistance, which is one of the foundational blocks of an IPM program, which I
Yeah.
recognized really quickly. I'm going to skip over this one and I'm going to hit everything else. And now I've got that figured out. Now I'm trying to go back to that other one, but it means me impacting my community. It can't just be me impacting my bee yard. If I can help bring better bees into the general area, that's going to be better for me as a beekeeper as well. So that I appreciate what you've been doing, what the SBGMI guys have been doing, that idea of that localized kind of problem solving.
Absolutely, and it's not just queens. If you can produce queens, and provide those locally, that's awesome. But then the drones that those queens produce, people
Right.
overlook that, but it's massive. Especially if you're queening whole apiaries with these, all the drones are producing are from selected stock, and that absolutely has ripple effects into your feral colonies and your local colonies, other beekeepers as well. So, yep, absolutely.
Well, I want to encourage Colorado beekeepers. This is a great time to give the Harbo assay a try. Even if you haven't been treatment free this year, just the process of trying it out. Many of you may be thinking about treatments. Maybe it's still a little too hot in the season and you're waiting for temperatures to go down. Right before those late summer treatments is a good kind of opportunity to see some mites in cap worker cells. So even though it might not be a valid score, you might get some false results because you've maybe treated in the spring or had OA strips on or whatever. It would still be a great time to practice this skill set to think about adding into your toolbox in the future. I want to add that the harbobeeco.com, I'll post this on the Colorado site. On John Harbo's website, he has a great document describing the entire process of how to do the Harbo assay. I'll post that as well. I'll post a couple other links. John Harbo does a great talk with the SBGMI as well, cracking that open. This talk here, again, added information on how to use this tool. So I want to encourage people to go out, give it a shot, give it a try, figure out what works, what doesn't work, figure out what headlamp doesn't work, what does, and then find a friend and talk to them about it, or try it with them, or try someone that you could teach it to next year. So I think it's
Yeah.
a great potential, Cory, and I'm really excited to be coming out with a bunch of Colorado beekeepers that are then going to be able to take this information and push it out to many other folks. Any last questions? Kathy asked, should those going to Missouri in August bring grafting frames, or do you have enough for those for everyone? Those are things we've talked about. We'll bring supplies, all that kind of good stuff. So
I've got, I think, how many were coming, Brian? Was it 8 or 9?
we got 7.
7. I think I've got 12 stations, so
Okay.
we should be totally good.
We'll bring some supplies too. Be
Cool.
flush.
Yeah. If you want to bring certain things, I think I've got enough forceps, but you'll probably want to try some of this stuff on your own whenever you get home. So if you want to bring fine forceps, vision aids, whether it be glasses, readers, magnification, wouldn't be a bad idea. Maybe LED headlamps, you can pick them up anywhere. The brighter, the better. I've got the frames to test. I've got stuff from me that we're testing. I've got stuff from other projects that we're testing, and I've got some random stuff. So we should see a variation. We shouldn't just see
Cool.
nothing but VSH till the cows come home. So it should be a good experience.
Right on. Well, thank you for your expertise, sharing it tonight and sharing it in a couple of weeks as we come out and visit with you. Cory, again, thank you for everything you do for the community. Really appreciate it. Have a great night.
You too. Safe travels, you all. We'll see you in a couple weeks.
And remember, Colorado Beekeepers Thursday night, if you're interested in listening to Dr. Lamas talk about the current state of the Beltsville Bee Lab, that'll be Thursday night at 7 o'clock. That link is on our Facebook page. I think that's been shot out. Kathy, has that been shot out an email to Colorado Beekeepers as well?
Yeah, I think yes, I believe so.
Okay. All right. So hope to see you Thursday night, folks. All right. Have a good night, everybody.
Bye.